Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar being brought to you by the British Standards Institution and the Institute of Fire Engineers. Today, we are talking about Approved Document B and its developments. So welcome aboard. I am Dan Rossiter, one of the sector leads here at the British Standards Institution, focusing on the built environment, and I'm just going to take you through a quick bit of housekeeping before we get underway for today's presentation. Hopefully you've been to one of these events before and you know the way that we operate. If not, I'll just give you a quick rundown of the way that this is going to work. Today is a listen-only webinar that's being recorded. This means you won't be able to turn on your own camera or turn on your own microphone. However, we do really encourage you to interact with today's webinar. The way that you can do so is through the Q&A function. If you look at the interface on the right-hand side of your screen, you should have an option to be able to ask questions. You can use that to either ask any technical queries that you have. So if, for example, you lose any of the audio or you can't see the slides being presented, please submit those questions using the Q&A function. However, we also would like you to comment and ask questions on today's presentation, and we have time at the end to handle any questions that you might have asked. So please put any of your technical or presentation related questions into that Q&A function as well as part of it. The way that we operate these webinars is that you're able to access them afterwards as well. There will be a feedback survey, and if you go through, complete the feedback survey, you'll have a link for an on-demand recording of the webinar in due course. And like many of our other webinars, this is a CPD recognized webinar. So you should be able to get your certificate as well following that same survey function. Hopefully, I think that's it from me. So what I'm going to do is hand over to our two impressive speakers, and I'll allow them to introduce themselves. So starting with Charles, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, sir.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I am Charles Romé. I am one of the technical policy officials looking after several parts of the building regulations, including Part B and the associated guidance. Throughout my career, I've worked both in the private sector and the public sector as a fire engineer before moving to the department. And I'll pass on to Amin.
Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be with you again at the fabulously impressive collaboration that we have put in place between the British Standards Institution and the Institution of Fire Engineers. My name is Aman Sharma. I'm here in my capacity as the Deputy Chair of the Building Regulations Advisory Committee. Thank you to Dan and thank you to Charles for his short introduction as well. For those who are unaware of what the Building Regulations Advisory Committee is and what we've been doing, we are the independent and non-departmental public body that advises the Secretary of State in England when they want to make building regulations and indeed set standards for the design and construction of buildings. And I know a number of you joining us today are following the events that are evolving with the Building Safety Act, the associated legislation that is supporting the Building Safety Act, but also the consequential amendments to the approved documents as well. We're here today to discuss approved document B, of course, but before we do, and as we move on to the next slide, I wanted to just set out a little bit of a reminder of the use and applicability of the approved documents before we dive into the nuances of the updates to Part B. Those who regularly use the approved documents or have a hand in the design and construction of buildings in England will, I hope, recognise that the approved documents are guidance. They are not the building regulations themselves, and the building regulations, of course, are dealt with within Schedule 1 of the Building Regulations 2010 as amended. And this guidance is to be used upon common building situations. I'm often asked for examples of what is the antithesis of a common building situation, and the Building Regulations Manual deals with some of those examples quite well, which you can see before you there. It sets out that such examples might include those with difficult ground conditions, including access conditions, so for example, for fire and rescue service access or indeed just general access purposes. Buildings with unusual occupancies or are perceived or will perceive to have high levels of complexity. Very large or very tall buildings, large timber buildings, and those buildings that incorporate modern construction methods. Users of the ADs should have sufficient skill and knowledge to understand the guidance and apply it correctly. I would extend that personally, although that's a direct lift from the Building Regulations Manual to the appropriate experience and behaviour as well, in line with the developing competency regulations, which is probably a discussion for another day. But thinking of competency in the round outside of the traditional attributes of skill and knowledge, I think is necessary to consider. What can I do? What is within my capability and my capacity? And most importantly, what's not within my capability and capacity to apply the guidance in an appropriate way and seeking the appropriate expertise to help complete that task. The final point on this is, as well as, of course, following the guidance either in a prescriptive way or otherwise doesn't guarantee compliance with those functional requirements, which are based in legality of the building regulations. This is guidance, and we'll get on to a little bit about why that's an important distinction to make. But for additional information, I think for those users who would even consider themselves to be experienced users of the approved documents, I would strongly encourage users to revisit the manual to the building regulations. I think it's a good starting point for anyone with any level of competence, expertise, knowledge and understanding in this area, and serves as good CPD for all of us. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. What you'll see here is an excerpt from the Building Act 1984 as is, and in particular a lift from Part 1 and Section 6 and 7 respectively, which I think further reinforces the points I've previously made on the practical applications of the approved documents. The Secretary of State has a duty to approve guidance, and in this case, the English Secretary of State has done that with the approved documents as we know them today. An important distinction yet again to make there is that a failure on anyone not complying with the approved document doesn't necessarily impose or imply any liability in the context of any civil or criminal proceedings. That is basically to say that you don't have to use these particular documents, this particular set of guidance, to demonstrate compliance to the functional requirements of the building regulations. And it's why, of course, we have other design guidance, particularly in the context of approved document B. And we may come on to talk about what alternatives that there are, of course, and indeed why it's suitable and sufficient to indeed adopt other design guidance in the context of previously as discussed for those uncommon building situations, and why it is incumbent upon the user themselves, the building control applicant and those involved in the design process, to make those confirmations at the earliest stages and follow that guidance. So whether it's a fully fire engineered approach using the BS 7974 suite, perhaps a 9991 design approach, those decisions should be made at the earliest opportunity so that it allows fire engineers and those supporting fire engineers to make an appropriate throughput of the application of that guidance, so that the body of evidence can be presented back to the local authorities and indeed the building safety regulator in the future, which we will come on to set out why and how the functional requirements of the building regulations have been met. So we can move on to the next slide, please. Let's start tackling approved document B specifically. So we should know, I hope all of us that has joined us today, that ADB sets out that guidance that allows users to design in accordance with to achieve requirements to Part B of Schedule 1 to the building regulations, dealt of course in the elements covering B1 to B5. The approved document itself is split into 2 volumes, dwellings for Volume 1 and buildings other than dwellings for Volume 2. But what we want to talk to you about in greater detail today is the technical review that we are undertaking to reform the guidance in an appropriate way, following the learning and understanding that has taken place since the tragic events that happened on 14th of June 2017, of course, the Grenfell Tower tragedy. We have a lot to learn, and we've been learning a lot, and industry has very much stepped up to the plate from my experience and has played its part in the overall reform and the continuing reform of approved document B, and indeed other approved documents as well, but of course the focus and indeed the spotlight will be on ADB. And so we're going to set out a little bit of what's been happening over the last few years, show you a little bit about what is still yet to happen, and indeed how that will take place under the future governance arrangement that the HSC and indeed the building safety regulator will provide moving forward. The heavy lifting, of course, for all of this remains within the technical policy division under the Department for Levelling Up, which the resource will eventually transition over to the building safety regulator. But it is BRAC that provides that independent oversight, particularly from a governance arrangement, and we'll show you a little bit of what that's like today. When I took the deputy chair position of the main BRAC committee, one of the objectives that I set the committee was to get some of this work more in the public domain, and this is one step of several to start to achieve that. Industry and indeed people that are joining us today and the peers you work with have to use this guidance, so it's right that the guidance is shaped by those that use it as well, and the governance structure that we have put in place and will continue to sustain will help facilitate that. So if we move on to the next slide, I think it's at this juncture I can pass back to Charles.
Yes, please. Thank you, Amand, for this introduction. Well, for all the background. I think you have alluded to everything which has been happening with regards to approved document B over the last 4 years, and I thought that would be a good place to start to highlight some of the work which the department has been carrying out over the last few years, and a few things have been happening. One of the first things we did following in 2018 is we introduced a statutory ban on the use of combustible materials in and on the external walls of buildings. As I'm hoping many people on this call will know, this applies to blocks of flats, hospitals and student accommodation with a story over 18 meters in height. It applies to the entirety of the external walls except the inner decorative finish, and requires all the materials bar a few exceptions to achieve the 2 highest classification with regards to reaction to fire performance. And one of the key things on the ban, I would say, is also that it applies in addition to requirement B4 of Schedule 1 of the building regulations. Some of the other work which has been going on is with regards to introducing new guidance for assessment in lieu of tests, which we did back in 2018, where we introduced some text in the annex of approved document B, which covered these types of assessment to make sure that people were using appropriate and accurate test data for these types of assessments. Another big bit of work we did we implemented back in 2019 was we undertook quite a large-scale clarification of approved document B. This was actually a huge program of work which involved quite a very close collaboration with BRAC and the BRAC working group. Following the consultation, I think we received something over 1,300 comments, and we split all of these comments in 5 groups, invited some additional experts to review each and every single one of the comments and see how we could improve the guidance. The main aim of the clarification was to enact the different splits of the approved document to follow the departmental style guide with regards to approved documents in general. So all of the approved documents look and feel the same. We also try to simplify the sentence structure, looking at bringing in more kind of plain English reviewers, etc., etc. We did a lot on trying to create some more bullet points, remove some of the unnecessary text, and focus on the European test methods. It was quite a lot of work, and and another thing we did during the clarification is we did quite a lot of work on diagrams, but I'll touch on that a little bit later. So that was quite a big, a large amount of work that we did, but we didn't stop there. Some of the other work that we have been doing has also been in launching the technical review following a call for evidence, which was launched in December 2018. And again, I'll touch a little bit more on the technical review later in this presentation. Some of the other things which have been happening are to do with sprinklers and wayfindings for firefighters, and the review well, sprinklers, evacuation alerts systems and wayfindings. We introduced some provisions in approved document Bs for sprinklers and new wayfinding signs for firefighters in new blocks of flats more than 11 meter in height in 2020, and we made some changes in June with regards to evacuation alert system and the review of the ban, which is what I think, if we go to the next slide, this is what this is the most recent changes we did to approved document B. These were these were published on the 1st of June 2022, and I thought that for the purpose of the discussion today, it would be good to try to go over what changes have been introduced through these changes. They focus mostly, as I mentioned, on the review of the ban of, the changes to the guidance following the review of the ban of combustible materials in and on externals of buildings, the provisions for secure information boxes, and evacuation alert systems, as well as some minor clarification. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail as to what this means. Next slide, please. So on the 1st of June, one of the things we did is we introduced a new statutory instrument. I'll spare everyone reading out the number, but this statutory instrument made several changes to the ban of combustible materials that I've mentioned already. We essentially extended the ban so that it would apply to hotels and boarding houses over 18 meters in height as well. And one of the other big things that we did is we introduced a ban on relevant metal composite materials panels on all buildings of any height. We did define relevant composite material panels as any panels or sheet having a thickness of no more than 10 millimeter, which is comprised of a number of layers, 2 or more of which are made of metal, alloy, or metal compound, and 1 or more of which is substantial and is made of materials having a gross calorific value of 35 megajoule per kilogram when tested in accordance with BSI 1716/2018. And for these purposes, a substantial layer is one which is at least 1 millimeter thick or has a mass per unit area of at least 1 kilogram per meter square. So this is essentially banning the use of ACM PE with ACM with unmodified polyethylene core, as well as other ACM panels with unmodified plastic cores, essentially. Anyway, following in this statutory instrument, what we also did is we defined solar shading devices, and we included them in the definition of specified attachments. Following a review of the original ban, solid shading devices had to be brought back within the scope of the ban, and we enacted this. And however, what we also introduced is an exemption for solid shading devices installed below 4.5 meter from ground level to this. Some of the other things that we did is we amended the exemption list to include other small materials which were flagged to us as potentially being problematic through the consultation, which included optic cables, insulation and waterproofing materials up to 300 millimeter above ground, and materials which form the top horizontal layer of a balcony if they meet the A1 or A2 A1FL or there's a typo there, A1FL or A2FL S1, and on the condition that there's an imperforate substrate below these. Some of the other changes included updating the reference to BSI 13501 Part 1, which is the classification for reaction to fire material, the European method for classification for reaction to fire materials. So we updated this to the latest classification available, and we extended the application of requirement B41 to material change of use in building exceeding 11 meter in height from 15 meters. What is, again, is the message that I'm trying to reinforce to everyone, is these changes do not These changes do not change the need to consider the relevant functional requirements of the Schedule 1 of the building regulations. It's the same thing then for the ban. The ban doesn't prevent or does not prohibit people from actually thinking about, for example, requirement B41 of the building regulation, which is quite an important part. Next slide, please. In line with all of the changes that we brought into the statutory instrument that we brought forward on the 1st of June 2022, we made several changes to approved document B, mostly in relation to section 10 and 12 of volume 1 and 2 respectively, to provide some additional guidance for buildings with a story more than 11 meter in height and less than 18 meters. Oh, here's another typo. Less than 18 meters in height. So buildings between 11 and 18 meters. Now there's some statutory guidance in approved document B as to what should be done. Essentially, buildings of this height will need to either meet the provisions in the guidance, so following the guidance on external wall surfaces, materials, products, and cavity barriers, or be able to meet the performance criteria given in BR 135 using test data from BS 8414. For buildings with a story more than between 11 and 18 meters in height, the amendment means that there are, if the first route of compliance is chosen, the external surface of external walls, as well as the materials and the materials as defined in section 10 and 12 of approved document B, volume 1 and 2 respectively, such as the insulation should or need to achieve a minimum of class A2S1 D0 or better. We have also introduced provisions for balconies as well for these types of buildings, and the balconies will also need to either only be constructed of materials of achieving class A2S1 D0 or better, or will need to be provided with an imperforate soffit which extends the full area of the balcony and achieves a minimum of REI 30 rating and is constructed of material achieving class A2S1 D0 better and complies with provisions on materials extending beyond the boundary line of the compartment. We also introduced in approved document B some further clarification on roofing membranes to take into account and some other changes to take into account some of the changes which are made through this statutory instrument. Next slide. So as mentioned earlier, as part of the June changes, we also included some of the other changes that we wanted to bring forward with regards to approved document B, other than the ones following the review of the ban. So we actually introduced some provisions for evacuation alert systems to be provided in all blocks of flats with a top story over 18 meter in height above ground level. And the system should be provided in accordance with BS 8629. Which is one of the newer British standards which has been introduced for evacuation alert system. Another thing that we did introduce back in June was provisions for secure information boxes, which should be provided in all blocks of flats with a top story more than 11 meter above ground level. And the content of the box the box needs to meet all of the following condition. It needs to have an appropriate size to hold all of the information, it needs to be easily located and identifiable by firefighters, and it needs to protect against the weather and resist unauthorized access while still being readily available by firefighters. So that's quite another important change we made to approved document B in terms of bringing these provisions into the guidance. Next slide. Finally, one of the things we sometimes get overlooked, but we do end up spending a fair bit of time. Some of the things we brought into our June 2022 amendments was some minor clarification, where what we did is there was a number of diagrams that we didn't quite clarified well enough back in 2019, so we did some further clarification on a selected number of diagrams. These usually involve quite a bit of work in trying to make sure that the diagrams are as clear as possible, which is always quite a technical challenge while retaining some of their meanings. So here's an example there that I've just picked out of there. Next slide. Finally, one of the things I really wanted to talk to everyone today about is the technical review of approved document B. This is one of the biggest, this is the biggest project we have ongoing with regards to approved document B. It's a program of essentially 16 research areas, which followed on from the call for evidence, which was launched in December 2018. So in December 2018, we launched a call for evidence, which basically asked for views and opinions as to which areas should we actually carry out research on. And following the closing and the review of this call for evidence, we identified 16 areas which deserved some research. We have commissioned 10 research in 2020, and these research projects are still mostly ongoing. The intention is for these to bring about the necessary evidence before we make any significant changes to the building regulations, and it will certainly, it certainly involves quite a lot of work on our side in making sure that the research delivers the outcome we want. I'm not necessarily going to go through all of these, but I thought for the purpose of today, I'd pick a few research projects which are definitely of interest for us. So there's a research project on means of escape for disabled people, which is very interesting for us and has meant quite a lot of work for the team in terms of bringing, in terms of understanding the relevant provisions in ADB and making sure that these are grounded in realistic expectations of management and building use, and recognize the up-to-date evidence on means of escape for disabled people. Another research project which I thought would be interesting to note for today is one about smoke and toxicity, which is aiming to provide the necessary evidence to assess the need and means to regulate toxicity of construction products in the event of a fire. Again, this is a big, long, complicated question, which is taking quite a lot of our time to try to make sure that we analyze it correctly, analyze what the evidence is available is. And another one which I'm going to select as well is the classification of external wall construction. This is a big, significant project which is going to take us into which is taking us through quite a journey, to be completely honest. The aim of the project is to provide a review of the current assessment methodology for fire performance of external wall systems, including the review of BS 8414 and BR 135 classification methodology. The ultimate aim is for us to ensure that the testing regime is fit for purpose and based on robust evidence to ensure buildings are safe and people are confident in the regulatory standards with regards to external wall testing. So again, there's a lot going on the technical review. We have published in June 2022 a very short update on the governmental website of where we are at with the technical review, the aims and objectives of each research project. And I would strongly recommend that everyone go and have a look at this web page. There's some more information about each of the work streams, including the one I've talked about. So if anyone is interested, please have a look. And I think the main message for me here is we are doing quite a lot of research to try to understand how we best change or amend the guidance and make sure that it is rooted in evidence, which is quite interesting. Anyway, I think Aman is now going to talk a little bit about the governance we put in place around the technical review. So if we go to the next slide.
Thank you very much, Charles. So the final few slides, what I want to do, well, the very first thing to do is just to reinforce some of the small print on on the previous slide there, and that the scope of the technical review was very much informed by that initial call for evidence. So this isn't government or advisory boards cherry picking subjects that they think are important to industry. I think it really underpins the necessity for consistent and effective industry engagement, especially through those all-important consultations, because these are the outputs, the quantitative and qualitative outputs that come from research programs like this are very much informed by that industry engagement process. So I think, just to reinforce that point, as I say, on keeping your ears to the ground, following the gov.uk web pages and responding to future consultations as and when they will arise, and I suspect we'll see a handful more in the very near future and in the mid to long-term future as well. Bringing the focus back onto the technical review, and an oversimplification maybe, but a necessary one. We thought it might be sensible to spare you the bureaucracy of the actual governance slide that's in place for this. But BRAC, I'm sure as you all know, is classified as a scientific advisory committee. We're governed by the rules set out under what's known as the COPSAC, so the Code of Practice for Scientific Advisory Committees. And I suspect nearly everyone on the call will appreciate the value and the role that independent scientific advice plays in government policy making, especially after events over the last few years. Why do I reinforce that point in particular? Well, very few decisions are made, and certainly BRAC does not make any advice to the Secretary of State without thinking about the scientific evidence that supports that advice. So that is to say that there needs to be a body of evidence suggesting why a change is being proposed and why indeed BRAC is making a position statement on a proposal, whatever that proposal might be. And that's important to reaffirm, because it's a principle that I, as the chair both of the BRAC ADB working group and as of course as deputy chair of the Building Regulations Advisory Committee, I think it's very, very critical to make sure it's embedded throughout the entirety of this work. We need to have a firm evidence base as to why we have taken the decisions that we've taken. For I think clear reasons, and I think probably discussions and events held at phase 1 and phase 2 of the Grenfell Tower inquiry set that out very, very clearly. But let me just talk to you a little bit about the process by which we make those considerations and the role that each of these boxes, if you like, on this governance slide play. Much, if not all, I would suggest, of the heavy lifting is done by the circa 10 technical steering groups that report directly back into DLUC, and of course the BRAC ADB working group. These are steering groups that are composed around the subject matters that you have seen on the previous slide. They turn on, they turn off, they stand up and stand down as needed, and indeed where future contracts will be issued to suppliers undertaking research to support this program of work, and indeed that will be supported by a new dedicated steering group. Interestingly, each of those steering groups is chaired by a member of the BRAC ADB working group, and that's important from my position as chair to have that consistency of upstream coming up to me. I can't, get across all of those steering groups, as you can imagine. Very few people can, but of course the job of government is to do that, and it provides challenges. But to upstream that insight and upstream those outputs as and when they arise from the individual contractors and present them in an appropriate way to make the considerations so that it can be further upstream to main BRAC. And of course, main BRAC's locus cuts across the entirety of Schedule 1 of the building regulations. So there's quite a bit more outside of fire safety that main BRAC has to consider, as you'd expect. But of course, further challenges then come from trying to map those considerations against other impacts that may or may not arise from considerations being made through other functional requirements. And I think a really good example of that is the interconnectivity that I hope we would all recognise between fire safety as it applies to clearly Part B to Schedule 1, but also Part A, elements of Part M as well, so access and structure for Part A, of course, and ensuring that there's commonality running through those recommendations, so there's no, there's not a disparate approach. So it's the main BRAC committee's job to try and sort of coordinate that activity. So you can see why that tiered system and approach is what we think is an effective one, and one that allows us to scale up and indeed scale down as is necessary. I think a final point on this before we move on to what I think is the final slide is that the line into or the line from BRAC going into the department also extends directly to the Secretary of State as well. It's a statutory function that BRAC has at the moment to advise the Secretary of State directly. We have done so in the past, and we will continue to do so where we feel necessary, of course, in the future. But the important point to make within this particular context is that BRAC is working very much hand in glove with the department at a policy level, a director level, ministerial level, and indeed, of course, the Secretary of State level as well, and we will continue to do so until we are asked not to anymore. Which brings me on to the final slide, because followers of the Building Safety Act and the reform agenda more broadly will recognise and already be aware, of course, that BRAC is due to stand down and will be abolished, and indeed the statutory provisions are laid and indeed in force, in fact, through the Building Safety Act to abolish BRAC and BRAC's subcommittees that support it, its statutory subcommittees, but indeed also the working groups and the steering groups that are underneath the governance of BRAC. And that's not just for fire safety, that's of course across the entirety of the building regulations. That's because, of course, that this entire function will be transitioning over to the HSC, and more specifically, the Building Safety Regulator. The new expert committee structure that will be in place cuts across subject matters including competence, resident engagement, and of course buildings as well. And a better and perhaps more accurate way to describe BRAC's transition, indeed of its locus and its primary function, is to describe it not as BRAC to what many will recognise as the new committee that may replace BRAC as BAC, so the Buildings Advisory Committee, but pointing out that BAC, as it will be under the BSR, will have a far wider locus than the current committee has, and so a more accurate way of describing this transition from an independent expert advice perspective is this transition is a BRAC to BSR, because it's the BSR operating model that will absorb the primary function of BRAC and its specific locus, but also introduce a wider and certainly a more external facing element to its work, allowing industry to help inform some of that work and also, of course, respond to dynamic issues that arise as well. Elements of the functions that are sit and belong very much within DLUC at the moment will also transition, and the sponsoring body for BRAC and the government department where this all sits at the moment will become a steward, and it's not to me to define what a steward will be, but clearly the building safety regulator will be an independent regulator of building safety, reporting directly back into the Department for Levelling Up and indeed the Secretary of State, who will retain the lawmaking function for building regulations and building safety. So again, if I dare to simplify that in a narrative, it would be that the heavy lifting is being done in the Health and Safety Executive and the BSR, and that upstreaming process will undergo its iterative processes to get back up to the Secretary of State to allow him or her to make and change, whether it's a building regulation, primary or secondary, or indeed an amendment to a piece of guidance. And I think that's where I'll probably stop, Dan, and pass back to you. And of course, with thanks to Charles, I'm sure there's a great deal of questions to get through, and perhaps it's good that we finished slightly ahead of schedule to tackle those in good time. So back to you, Dan, and thank you for the opportunity today.
Well, no, and thank you for coming along, Amand, to present. And yes, you're right. There have been a raft of questions, and with over 700 of you watching, and thank you for joining today. An awful lot of questions have come through, some very technical and very specific, and some very broad questions. So what I will do is, in the interest of fairness, I will try to focus on the questions that are linked together where the most people have asked something in a fairly similar topic, to try and appease the most people as we go, and to try and help out. Someone has asked a question about questions we don't answer, and what I'll just clarify is that any questions we don't get through today, we'll share them with the panel, and those that are appropriate for today's topic, we might try and form some form of post kind of Q&A document or something similar to answer those. But questions about can like volume of audio or similar, they obviously won't make it in. So not every question will, but we'll try to make sure the right ones are in there with answers. And on that note, I have seen an awful lot of questions about 9999 and BS 9991. And so, for example, I think Indica, not to name everyone by name, but there's certainly a few of them, Granville, Gabriel, and a few others have all been asking questions about the relationship between ADB and these British standards. So I wonder, as an opening gambit, as there seem to be so many of them on there, could you please clarify, is there any coordination or relationship between those standards and these approved documents?
So I'll probably take that one to start with. So yes, there is a level of coordination. So for example, I personally sit on the current review of BS 9991 and some of the parent committees associated with this. However, I'm pretty sure that everyone will appreciate is we are only one voice amongst the panel, and all of the decisions for British Standards Committee are decisions taken by the panel assembled for this specific committee. So everything is done in accordance with BS0, which has some quite tight rules on how things go. So I think the answer to the question is yes, there is a level of coordination between the two, and there's a level of understanding. It doesn't mean, however, that the decisions being taken are the same, and I do appreciate that there's a little bit of variation between the two. And again, BS 9991, which is currently undergoing a review following a public consultation earlier in the year, I believe. All of the devolved administrations as well have a seat on the panel and are certainly expressing different views. So yes, there is a level of coordination. No, it doesn't mean that everything is going to be the same.
And nor should it be the same either, and that's an important distinction to make, because it goes back to the point I think we were making at the beginning. There's a reason we have BS 9999, there's a reason we have BS 9991, and indeed there's a reason we have the approved documents. They all serve at their core principles a common purpose, but they are in existence for very specific reasons. So coordination, absolutely. Alignment, no, because that kind of defeats the object. We don't want where alignment is necessary. In those features that it does need to align, we don't want the same document trying to say wholly the same thing. And it's a very trying task for our departmental officials and our civil service colleagues to have to try and sort of pull that connectivity together, because it means that people like poor old Charles have to sit on several BSI committees and several industry working groups. But that's where I allude to, and I'll revisit the importance of industry owning elements of this guidance and placing those attributes of accountability and responsibility back in the work that we do. And that's what very much what we're trying to do with elements of the technical review for the approved document as well, not least through the importance of engaging with early call for evidences and consultations, and really thinking about the responses that we are making into government. And I assure you, and I'm not sitting here as a civil servant, of course, merely as an advisor to the civil servant, but I can assure you those responses are considered in significant detail, because as an advisor, I have to help consider them. So it's not time wasted, and it's very much at the principles and some of the core principles that are discussed, of course, down in BS Naught, and that consensus-driven guidance. And in the case of ADB in particular, that guidance being developed with a sound scientific evidence base.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you. And on the subject of that sound scientific evidence base, I've managed to do a segue, which I'm quite chuffed by, in that, and it's relieving to see how it appears the presentations hit the mark quite well for what people are asking for, because a number of these questions have been dealt with through the presentation. So well done. Because a few questions have come up about the technical research that takes place for the approved documents. And an early question we had was actually what that research is. And I think, Charles, you helpfully showed some of the future facing bits that are being worked on. And a question that's come through is about time frame for some of those, because obviously we had short, medium and long there. So while you probably can't plant your flag to the mast on where the dates are, but is there an indication of durations for some of those periods to understand that? And what I'll slip in there, if appropriate, is a couple of questions seem to have come in about evidence or research relating to electric vehicles in covered car parks. I'm just wondering, I did see basements on there, but I don't know whether that was part of that or if it's something separate. I don't know. So any insight there would be great.
So in terms of timelines, I think when we initially set out the technical review, we were quite mindful of trying to look at the different timelines and how we could actually make everything work. A lot of work went in to try to plan things meticulously in terms of the technical review. However, as I'm sure people listening in will appreciate, sometimes research takes you in places that you did not know until you've actually started some of the research. So there's quite a lot of complexity in planning some of the timelines. What typically will happen for us, or what we are looking at for us, is this is why we try to divide some of these projects in kind of relatively short-term projects, some of which are coming towards the completion. And we are looking at, we are heading towards the end of some of these projects, although some have had actually some delays. So hopefully some of these will be concluded, and we'll be looking at what the evidence have been produced. As Amand has highlighted, then there is a process for us to then go out to consultation and make sure that we consult on what do we think the research has told us, and is everyone agreeing with what the research has told us, and the findings and the changes which should be brought into the approved document. So I'm afraid I'm not being very committal in terms of timelines, but I think these short, medium, and long term, we're very much trying to highlight kind of periods of time, probably around the 2 years, potentially a little bit more, depending on some of how some of these research projects we're going, and we're certainly going to be looking at implementing some of the changes very soon. Again, as everyone is aware, we will be going out through a consultation process anyway when some of these changes are being brought into the approved document. Before I pass on to Aman, I'll tackle the questions about electrical vehicle. So this is a question that is being raised with us quite a number of times, and we are looking at periods of fire resistance. We are looking at periods of fire resistance in relation to electrical vehicle fires in basement car parks, specifically through the fire resistance projects. However, there's also a great deal of work which is being done by, OZEV, which is another governmental body looking after electrical vehicles specifically, and I know that they have commissioned some research on electrical vehicles more broadly, and the last I heard, they were looking at potentially trying to publish some guidance soon, in due course, let's say, on electrical vehicles. I know that quite a lot of work is being done by OZEV and I'll have to Google what the acronym stands for. Anyway, Aman, I don't know if there's anything else you want to.
Yeah, just a couple of things. I think the short answer is to the specific question on EV is yes. There is some thinking happening in that space, and the reason that we've been able to incorporate that thinking within the technical review, but also cascading some of that industry research and development, particularly in the space of EV, is because the governance arrangement that Charles and the team, myself and others have put in place and thought long and hard about putting in place for the long-term future allows us to be as reactive as proactive as we like to be. So, we have to, as Charles has highlighted, be able to move in different directions where the research is suggesting that we need to refocus some energy and some attention. And, the structure that we have around us allows us to do that, and that's important. Speaking to the timeline piece, it's inappropriate, and it's very, very difficult to sort of speak to specific dates and years and months and what have you. What I will say, because this is information in the public domain, and because of course BRAC, as you'd expect, has been supporting the Health and Safety Executive and indeed the BSI in its shadow form at the moment in transitioning this work, but also transitioning the wider locus of what BRAC's role is that we expect BRAC to be abolished in spring next year, at some point in spring next year, and the new committee, so the Building Advisory Committee, to have been stood up and operating by that point. And it is by that point that we will expect a very smooth, and it will be a very smooth transition, I assure you, of this work to have been fully embedded under that new operating model, replicating the governance or elements of the governance structure, so that there is as little risk as possible to the continuation of this work. And I can assure you that HSE officials are absolutely in line with that. We're dealing with these conversations at the most senior and strategic levels to make sure that the nuts and bolts that allow us to put that in place are there. And that includes, by the way, the elements of the composition of who the individuals are, even sort of supporting this work at the moment, and indeed identifying future resources that would be required. So the reason I mentioned that specifically is because invariably, and as you'd expect, the timelines pass over that transition date. So, a great deal of this work will have to continue under the new remit of the BSR and the operating model. So, we have some of these contracts, going well beyond that date. So you would expect elements of them to continue. And the job that we have at hand is to ensure a seamless and successful transition of that work.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you. Conscious of time, I'll try and ask a couple more and ask if I can try and get some succinct answers for a couple of these, to try and fit a couple in. The first is that there's a question that's come through in advance and also through here. I can see questions about whether any of these amendments are going to be retrospectively applied. So I guess, Charles, I think we were talking about it very briefly beforehand. Is any of it retrospective?
So, I mean, at the moment, none of the changes in the building regulation or the changes to the building regulations do not apply retrospectively. So this is how the building regulations have historically worked: is they don't apply retrospectively some of the changes. So yeah, that's the succinct answer.
Brilliant. No, thank you. I've had a question from Marion through the webinar, and then also some in advance about how it applies in devolved nations. So there's been a question of, is it applicable to Wales? And then also there's been a question about Scotland and Northern Ireland separately.
So, which is an easy enough answer, that building regulations are a devolved matter, and each devolved administration have got their own sets of building regulations as well as associated guidance. Which means that in Scotland they have the technical handbook. In Wales they've got a slightly different, well, they've got very different version of ADB, and the same in Northern Ireland. Some of these changes, it's something that we do talk about, and there is a level of coordination between the devolved administration and ourselves. We have technical discussions about some of the changes, and there's a level of coordination which is always helpful. Again, it doesn't mean that everyone is doing the same, nor should it be.
No, brilliant. And then my last question I'll have, and then we'll wrap up. and I'll multifacet a few things together for this. And there's some questions about future amendments to ADBs themselves. The first one that's coming from Matt is about the June 2020 update, which was an amendment, but published according to the question as a separate document. So will that get incorporated as part of a future amendment? I'm just reading the question as it's written. A pre-advanced question is asked about the Sir Martin Morbick report and whether any of those changes will be incorporated. I've also had a question about, and for the time I might forget who it's attributed to, so I will apologise to them, about whether modern methods of construction are going to be considered in future amendments, where things obviously like SIPs and other bits, and those manufacturing-led approaches. There it is from Dave. Asking about whether ADB will reflect some of those modern methods as well in future amendments. So if you wouldn't mind.
So a couple of questions in quick succession, and forgive me if I've forgotten the first bit is, so in terms of ADB changes, I think the main thing, the main message out of today is we are doing quite a lot of research, and we are doing quite a lot of work in trying to bring some of the changes to ADB as soon and as quickly as possible. But we fundamentally have a need to make sure that it's based on robust evidence. And the primary aim of the technical review is to bring that robust evidence before we bring changes to the approved document. The standard process is for us to go out for, well, the process which is actually mandated in the Building Act is for us to go out to consultation before any changes are made to the building regulations, and we need to consult people. So any of these changes coming will need to go out through consultation again. I think the first question was about how the June 2020 will be incorporated in the guidance. What we typically do again is when we first publish the amendments to approved document B, we publish a amendment booklet which tells people, well, this is what sentence is being changed by what in the approved documents, and then on the day that the provision starts, which for the June 2022 amendments is the 1st of December, we publish, or shortly after, we publish the full consolidated approved document in place. So watch out on Thursday for that publication, or shortly after, hopefully, that will be sorted. So all of this is being done. Final question, which is about MMC. Yes, this is a question which I believe is probably beyond approved document B, to be completely honest. There are considerations about modern methods of constructions which are well beyond just fire safety. There are some structural safety issues to be considered, as moisture, etc., etc. And this is something that the department is definitely looking at with two different hats on in terms of method of construction. But this is definitely another area which is not specifically highlighted in the technical review, but this is definitely an area that we are doing some work on.
I think that just to add to that as well, Charles. I mean, Charles would appreciate, but I think for the audience as well, MMC. At some stage, we're going to have to stop. We're going to have to drop the first M, aren't we? Because it's a misnomer at this point. But it's a cross-departmental issue as well, so it's not just something being discussed within DLUC and BSI HSC. And again, that going back to that connectivity piece, to try and make sure that policies are aligned is no small task at all. There's a wider question which we won't tackle in 30 seconds or so that we have left on whether or not that falls quite into the category of the common building situation or not. But perhaps that's another webinar on its own for another day, Dan. But no, it extends beyond levelling up priorities, home office priorities as well. There are other issues that need to be tackled in and around.
No, that's brilliant. And so what I'll do there, I will draw the questions to a close there and just say thank you very much, Aman and Charles. And I can see there are some thank yous in the Q&A as well. So thank you both for that. And what I'll just quickly sum up is to say that, of course, we have these webinars. There are other ones that have been on demand. So if you've missed some of our BSI and IFE series, you're more than welcome to go to the website to look at those. And then upcoming webinars that we have is actually our BSI Global Built Environment Congress. Yes, it is difficult to say, but it is well worth attending. And you'll see some of the dates on there where we have a session Morning of the 30th on health, safety, well-being. The afternoon I'm hosting for cyber physical infrastructure. So please do make an effort to attend that one, at the very least so I can win the most audience members. So all 670 odd who are still on, you're more than welcome to register to that event. Don't worry about the others. Quality and value on the 1st of December, and almost like quite kind of well-timed, modern methods of construction in the afternoon. So those panels will run similar to these. They're half-day events. You're more than welcome to attend. Generally, for more information, you can go to our website. Thank you very much for joining. These IFE collaborations have been incredibly successful, and we hope to do more of this in the future. So what I'll just say is thank you. Enjoy the rest of your days. Thank you again, Aman. Thank you, Charles. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you all, and God bless.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks all.
Thanks, Dan. Bye.
Drop.